December 1942. Somewhere over the Solomon Islands, a kid named Eddie Kowalski stands in the belly of a B-17, hands locked on a Browning M2 that's shaking like it wants to tear itself apart. He's 19 years old, waist gunner. He's been in combat for 6 weeks, and he's about to learn something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. A Japanese Zero slides into view at 10 o'clock, maybe 300 yards out, moving left to right across his field of vision like a thrown knife. Clean shot, perfect angle. Eddie does exactly what every instinct in his body, every hour of training, every ounce of common sense tells him to do. He puts the crosshairs directly on the enemy plane's fuselage, centers it, breathes, and squeezes the trigger. 50 rounds scream out, tracer fire arcs through the Pacific sky, bright and beautiful. And Eddie watches every single bullet pass harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. Not close, not even threatening, just empty air. The Japanese pilot doesn't flinch, doesn't take evasive action, doesn't even seem to notice he's being shot at. He just keeps flying, completely untouched, while Eddie's ammunition counter spins down toward empty and his heart climbs into his throat. This wasn't Eddie's failure. This wasn't poor training or bad luck or equipment malfunction. This same scene was playing out thousands of times across every theater of World War II during those early years. American gunners, well-trained, motivated, equipped with the finest machine guns ever manufactured, were missing. Not occasionally, constantly, catastrophically. The Army Air Forces conducted a study in early 1943, analyzing gun camera footage from bomber missions over Europe and the Pacific. They reviewed thousands of hours of film, tens of thousands of engagements. They counted rounds fired and hits achieved. Then they did the math, and the math was terrifying. Trained aerial gunners were achieving hit rates below 4% against crossing targets. 4%. That meant for every 100 rounds fired at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicular to the gunner's position, 96 bullets were hitting nothing but air. Think about that for a moment. The most advanced military in the world, equipped with weapons that cost a fortune to manufacture and ship halfway around the planet, was missing 96 times out of every 100 shots. The statistics translated directly into body counts. A typical engagement lasted 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy fighter broke off or moved out of range. The Browning M2 fired roughly 800 rounds per minute, about 13 rounds per second. In a 10-second engagement, a gunner could theoretically put 130 rounds into the air. With a 4% hit rate, that meant 5 bullets might actually strike the target. Maybe. 5 hits weren't enough to down a Zero. Not even close. And definitely not enough to stop something rugged like a Focke-Wulf FW-190. German and Japanese fighters could absorb dozens of 50 caliber rounds and keep flying. Keep fighting. Keep killing. The human cost was staggering in ways that numbers almost can't capture. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force flying over Europe lost 188 bombers per month on average. Each B-17 carried 10 men. That's 1,880 aircrew, killed, captured, or missing every 30 days, every single month. And a significant percentage of those losses came from bomber formations that simply couldn't defend themselves effectively against fighter attacks because their gunners couldn't hit what they were aiming at. The gunners were doing everything right according to their training. They were tracking targets, maintaining sight picture, controlling their bursts. The problem wasn't their courage, it wasn't their commitment, it wasn't their eyesight or their reflexes or their will to survive. The problem was physics, and physics didn't care about bravery. Physics didn't care about anything. Every gunner instinctively aimed directly at what they could see. It made perfect sense. You point at the thing you want to hit. You pull the trigger. The thing gets hit. That logic works fine when you're shooting at a stationary target on a rifle range. It even works when you're hunting a deer moving at 20 miles an hour through the woods. But enemy fighters weren't deer. They were crossing the gunner's field of view at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Some of the late war models, like the Me-262 jet, could hit 540. At those velocities, the time it took for a bullet to travel from the gun muzzle to the target's position meant the target wasn't there anymore by the time the bullet arrived. It had moved. The bullet traveled through empty space where an aircraft had been a fraction of a second earlier, passing through a ghost, while the real plane continued untouched. And men kept dying because nobody understood how to solve it. The bullet itself moved fast, roughly 2,900 feet per second, leaving the barrel of a Browning M2. That sounds instantaneous. At short ranges against slow targets, it effectively was instantaneous. But in aerial combat, short range meant 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were screaming through the sky at speeds that would have seemed impossible just 20 years earlier. Do the physics: a Zero flying at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet every single second. Now do the math on a 300-yard shot. That's 900 feet. At 2,900 feet per second, the bullet needed roughly 0.31 seconds to cover that distance. Doesn't sound like much, does it? A third of a second. Blink of an eye. But in those 0.31 seconds, that Zero moved another 136 feet forward. 11 car lengths. The gunner aimed at where the aircraft was. The bullet arrived at where the aircraft had been a third of a second ago, passing through empty air while the enemy fighter continued unscathed, already lining up its own guns for a killing pass. This phenomenon had a name: deflection error. Military scientists understood it in theory long before World War II started. You could find papers about it in artillery journals and ballistics textbooks, but understanding something in a classroom with chalk and diagrams and controlled experiments is entirely different. From solving it in combat, when someone's trying to kill you and your aircraft is shaking and your oxygen mask is fogging up at 25,000 feet, and you have maybe 4 seconds to make a decision that determines whether you live or die. The deflection required wasn't some minor adjustment, some small correction you could eyeball and estimate. It was massive, counterintuitive. Against a target crossing at 90 degrees at 300 yards distance, a gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. That meant putting your crosshairs on what looked like completely empty sky, aiming at nothing, trusting that the target would fly into your stream of bullets. Every human instinct screamed against it. Your brain saw the enemy plane. Your eyes tracked the enemy plane. Your survival instinct demanded you shoot the enemy plane, and the correct response was to aim somewhere else entirely, at a point in space where nothing existed, and pull the trigger while your conscious mind was shouting that you were insane. Gunnery instructors tried teaching deflection shooting during training. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo, Texas, put students through rigorous programs starting in 1942. Trainees spent hours in turret simulators, shot at towed targets from moving trucks, studied diagrams showing proper lead angles with arrows and numbers and careful explanations. None of it translated effectively to real combat. The problem was complexity layered on top of impossibility. Deflection wasn't a single calculation you could memorize and apply. It changed constantly, depending on target speed, target angle, range, altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, whether your own aircraft was turning. A B-17 ball turret gunner engaging a Bf-109, making a frontal attack, needed different deflection than the same gunner engaging the same aircraft during a beam attack from the side, and he had maybe 4 seconds to process all those variables while being shot at, while his aircraft bucked through flak damage, while his hands shook with adrenaline and cold, while every survival instinct in his DNA screamed at him to just point and shoot at the visible threat. The psychological barrier was just as deadly as the technical one, maybe more deadly. Gunners who survived their first few missions and actually tried implementing deflection shooting often abandoned the technique after apparent failures. They'd aim ahead of a target like they'd been taught, fire a burst, see their tracers arc through empty sky in front of the enemy plane, and conclude they'd led too much. Next engagement, they'd reduce their lead, moving their aim point closer to the visible target. They were self-correcting in exactly the wrong direction, trusting their eyes over the physics they couldn't see, and men died because of it. Gun camera footage from 1943 missions shows this pattern repeatedly, over and over like a nightmare on loop. Initial bursts with some forward lead, then subsequent bursts walking backward, moving closer and closer to the actual visible target until the gunner was shooting directly at, or even slightly behind, the target's current position, shooting at where the plane had been, not where it was, and definitely not where it would be when the bullets arrived. The casualties mounted like a tide coming in. 8th Air Force records from the October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt showed 20% losses. 60 bombers failing to return out of 291 dispatched. The survivors landed with dead and wounded crewmen, sprawled in blood-slicked compartments, shredded hydraulic lines, engines trailing smoke. In the debriefings afterward, sitting in Nissen huts with cups of coffee shaking in their hands, gunners reported the same frustration over and over. They'd been shooting. Their guns had been working. The ammunition had been good, but their bullets hadn't been connecting. They knew they were missing. They could see it. They just didn't understand why or how to fix it. Something fundamental had to change, and it had to change fast. Because at the current loss rates, the entire Allied bombing campaign would collapse before it ever reached Berlin. The 8th Air Force would be bled white, reduced to a memory, and the war would be lost. Because American gunners couldn't solve a physics problem that had been sitting in a filing cabinet since 1924. The solution had been there all along, written by a man most combat aircrews had never heard of, Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle. Not the historical Puckle who invented the defense gun centuries earlier, but an American artillery officer with a gift for ballistics and an unsettling ability to see the future. He'd published a technical paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery, while serving as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School. The year was 1924. Aviation was still young. Most military aircraft couldn't break 150 miles per hour. But Puckle looked at the trajectory of technological development and saw what was coming. He wasn't some theoretical academic disconnected from reality. He'd served in France during World War I, witnessed the first clumsy attempts at air-to-air combat, where pilots took potshots at each other with pistols and rifles, and he recognized that aviation speeds were about to create a targeting crisis that traditional marksmanship simply couldn't solve. His paper laid out the mathematics with brutal, uncompromising clarity. Puckle demonstrated that as aircraft speeds increased beyond 150 miles per hour, the deflection angles required would exceed human intuitive capability. He calculated that against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target. His paper included tables, exhaustive charts showing required lead for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. A 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300-mile-per-hour target required 47 feet of lead. Same target at 400 yards required 94 feet. The numbers were staggering, almost unbelievable. And Puckle's conclusion was even more disturbing, almost prophetic in its accuracy. Without mechanical assistance, he wrote, aerial gunners would be effectively useless within a decade. The Army filed his paper in a cabinet somewhere and forgot about it. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation advanced rapidly. Aircraft got faster, more maneuverable, more lethal, but gunnery training remained rooted in World War I methodology, teaching techniques that had been obsolete before they were even formalized. Instructors taught marksmanship fundamentals: sight picture, trigger control, breath control, steady hands, as if students were preparing for a rifle competition, rather than a three-dimensional chase at 300 miles an hour where hesitation meant death. The few voices advocating for advanced deflection training were dismissed as alarmists, overly technical. The reasoning went like this. Americans had always been excellent marksmen. Daniel Boone, Sergeant York. The frontier tradition of sharpshooting was built into the national character. Surely those skills would translate to aerial combat with proper practice. Surely instinct and natural talent would be enough. They weren't. Not even close. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Army Air Force's gunnery training was catastrophically unprepared for the reality of modern air combat. The standard training program lasted 4 weeks. 4 weeks to turn a farm kid or a factory worker or a college dropout into someone who could defend a bomber against the best fighter pilots Germany and Japan could produce. Students fired roughly 1,000 rounds total during their entire qualification course. Most of that ammunition went towards stationary targets and slowly towed sleeves that moved at maybe 150 miles per hour in predictable straight lines. Not a single training scenario replicated the chaos of an FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while executing a barrel roll. Graduates received their wings, climbed into bombers, flew to England or the Pacific, and discovered their training was worthless the first time a zero flashed across their gunsight, like a knife through silk. By mid-1942, desperate commanders started digging through old technical libraries, looking for anything that might help. Anything at all. A captain named Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section, found Puckle's 1924 paper in the archives at Wright Field. Williams read it in one sitting, then immediately drafted a memo to his commanding officer. 2 words were underlined 3 times in his report. He knew. Puckle had predicted this exact disaster 18 years before the first B-17 ever flew a combat mission over Europe. His calculations were still accurate. His warnings had been correct. His predictions had come true with horrifying precision, and hundreds of American aircrew had died because nobody had listened to a man who'd seen the future and tried to warn them. The question wasn't whether Puckle had been right. The mathematics were indisputable. The question was whether anything could actually be done about it now. In the middle of a war, with men dying every day, training gunners to consciously calculate deflection angles while being shot at seemed impossible. The human brain couldn't process trigonometry at combat speed. You couldn't expect a 19-year-old kid from Iowa to solve differential equations in his head while a Messerschmitt was trying to kill him. But if conscious calculation wouldn't work, maybe something else would. Maybe there was another way. The British had already started finding answers, born from the same desperation. During the summer of 1940, when their backs were against the wall and invasion seemed inevitable, RAF Squadron 609, flying Spitfires out of Middle Wallop, faced a gunnery crisis that mirrored what American bombers would encounter 2 years later. Their pilots were brave. Their aircraft were magnificent, arguably the finest fighters in the world. But they were missing. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas reviewed gun camera footage from July engagements and discovered his squadron's hit rate against crossing Messerschmitt BF-109s was hovering around 6%, 6 shots connecting out of every 100 fired. The Spitfire carried enough ammunition for roughly 16 seconds of sustained fire. Pilots were burning through their entire combat load and watching German fighters fly home, untouched, unharmed, unpunished. Squadron leader Horace Darley, commanding 609 Squadron, made a radical decision that should have gotten him court-martialed. He grounded his entire unit for 3 days in early August 1940, right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, when every fighter was desperately needed in the air, when Britain's survival hung by a thread. And he conducted live-fire experiments that violated every standard in the RAF training manual. Darley had been a competitive clay pigeon shooter before the war, and he understood something about leading moving targets that military theorists had completely overlooked. The best shotgun shooters didn't calculate lead. They didn't do math. They felt it. Their brains processed the target's movement subconsciously. Their hands moved the barrel ahead of the clay disc without conscious mathematical thought. It happened automatically, instinctively, the way you catch a ball without calculating parabolic trajectories. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn the same instinctive response. If the conscious brain was too slow, maybe the subconscious could be trained to handle it. His experiment was brutally simple in concept, though terrifying in execution. He had a Hurricane fighter tow a target banner across the gunnery range, while his Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. But instead of the standard approach, pilots aiming carefully, trying to calculate the precise lead angle, trying to think their way through the problem, Darley instructed them to do something that sounded completely insane. Don't aim at all. Instead, watch the target's movement. Let your eyes track its path naturally. And start firing while your aircraft is still turning to follow. Let the deflection happen naturally through the motion of your turn, rather than trying to consciously create it with aiming adjustments. Fire into where your instincts say the target is going, not where your eyes say it currently is. Trust motion over sight. The first attempts were disasters, absolute catastrophes. Pilots missed the banner by 50 feet or more, their bullets stitching patterns across empty sky, nowhere near the target. But Darley made them repeat the exercise, again, again, again. 40 passes each over 3 days. No lectures about ballistics, no trigonometry, no tables of deflection angles. Just repetition with one simple instruction. Fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the third day, something remarkable happened. Something almost miraculous. The pilots' hit rates began climbing, not dramatically at first. They went from 6% to maybe 12%. But that doubling meant twice as many bullets hitting German aircraft, which meant twice as many kills, twice as many damaged enemy fighters returning to base, unable to fly the next mission, unable to kill more British pilots, unable to support an invasion. Darley documented his results and submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His report included a crucial observation that would change everything. The pilots who improved fastest weren't the ones with the best peacetime marksmanship scores. They weren't the ones who could put 10 rounds through the same hole on a rifle range. They were the ones who could suppress their instinct to aim carefully and instead trust their peripheral vision and motion sense. The conscious brain, Darley argued, was too slow for modern air combat. The answer was training the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, the same way a baseball player's brain calculates where a fly ball will land without consciously solving trajectory equations. Fighter Command circulated Darley's findings, but implementation was scattered and inconsistent across the RAF. Some squadrons adopted the technique enthusiastically. Others dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's training command was particularly resistant. Their instructors had decades of experience teaching marksmanship fundamentals, and Darley's approach seemed to abandon everything they knew about proper shooting discipline. It felt wrong, looked wrong, went against every principle they'd spent careers perfecting. But combat results didn't lie. Numbers don't care about tradition or ego. Squadrons that embraced motion-based deflection shooting showed measurably better kill ratios through the autumn of 1940. The data was clear enough that by early 1941, the technique was quietly becoming standard practice across Fighter Command, even if the official training manuals hadn't caught up yet. American military observers in Britain took detailed notes on Darley's methods, interviewed pilots, watched training exercises, but the United States Army Air Forces faced a fundamentally different problem. Fighter pilots could potentially learn instinctive deflection through repetition and aircraft maneuvers. A Spitfire pilot controlled his entire aircraft, using motion and angles to create natural lead. But bomber gunners couldn't do that. A waist gunner in a B-17 stood in a fixed position, while his aircraft flew straight and level through flak. He couldn't maneuver, couldn't dive or turn or roll, couldn't use aircraft movement to generate deflection naturally. He had only his hands on the gun and his eyes on the target. If conscious calculation was too slow and instinctive motion wasn't available, the solution had to be mechanical. Someone had to build a machine that could solve the problem faster than a human brain. Enter the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically the Radiation Laboratories Division 7, established in early 1942. The name was deliberate misdirection. Radiation Laboratory suggested atomic research, which helped maintain secrecy around what Division 7 actually built. Fire control systems. The head of the division was Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a 40-year-old engineer who'd spent the previous decade developing gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper understood that the deflection problem wasn't fundamentally about shooting. It was about prediction. A gun sight needed to show the gunner not where the target currently was, but where the target would be when the bullets arrived. It needed to see the future. The Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Draper's laboratory in prototype form by July 1943. It looked like something from science fiction, a reflector sight connected to a gyroscope system that weighed 28 pounds and required electrical power from the aircraft's generator system. The gunner operated it through a mechanical ranging control. He turned a dial to match a set of reference marks to the target's wingspan, which gave the sight the range information it needed. Then he tracked the target for approximately 2 seconds while keeping it centered in a small tracking circle. During those 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured the target's angular velocity, how fast it was moving across the gunner's field of view. Here's where it got remarkable, almost magical. The Mark 14's internal mechanism used a series of cams and gears, analog computers built from machined metal, to solve the deflection equation in real time. It took the range input from the gunner, the angular velocity from the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the .50 caliber round. Then it calculated exactly how far ahead of the target the guns needed to point, and it displayed the result as a lighted reticle that appeared to float in space ahead of the target. The gunner didn't aim at the aircraft anymore. He aimed at the glowing dot. And if he'd ranged correctly and tracked smoothly, the dot showed him exactly where to shoot. The Mark 14 solved mathematics that would take a human brain several minutes, using pencil and paper, and it solved those equations 30 times per second, continuously updating as the target's angle and range changed. Testing at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia during August 1943 produced results that seemed almost impossible. Nearly unbelievable. Gunners who'd never achieved better than 5% hit rates against crossing targets immediately jumped to 18% with the Mark 14, and that was on their first day using the system. First day. No extensive training. No weeks of practice. Just hand them the sight and watch their effectiveness triple instantly. After a week of practice, rates climbed above 25%. That was a 5-fold improvement over manual aiming, which translated directly into 5 times more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed per engagement. But manufacturing and installing tens of thousands of Mark 14 sights across the bomber fleet would take time the Allies didn't have. Production didn't begin in meaningful numbers until early 1944, and installation priority went to new aircraft rolling off assembly lines rather than retrofitting existing bombers. Economics and logistics. That meant the majority of gunners flying. Missions through late 1943 and early 1944 were still using basic iron sights or crude reflector sights with no computing ability whatsoever. They needed something they could implement immediately, without waiting for new technology, without requiring electrical modifications to their aircraft, without needing factories to retool or supply chains to adapt. They needed a technique that worked with the equipment they already had, right now today. The breakthrough came not from engineers or scientists or university laboratories. It came from combat gunners themselves. Specifically from the Pacific Theater, where engagement distances and visibility were often better than over cloud-covered Europe. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a waist gunner aboard the USS Lexington's Air Group Support Staff by March 1944, had flown 31 combat missions and survived 4 aircraft losses. Fleming wasn't an officer, didn't have a college education, couldn't explain gyroscopic precession if his life depended on it, but he'd fired approximately 40,000 rounds in combat. He'd personally witnessed hits on 7 enemy aircraft, and he'd kept a notebook. Fleming's notebook contained something unusual, sketches of enemy aircraft with hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses, showing where he'd actually aimed during successful engagements. He'd measured these lead distances by comparing them to the target aircraft's length. 2 plane lengths ahead, 3 plane lengths ahead. Simple visual references he could remember and apply instantly without calculation. On March 14, 1944, Fleming presented his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare during a routine debriefing session. O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's top tacticians, immediately recognized what he was seeing. Empirical deflection data gathered under actual combat conditions. Not theory, not simulation. Real information from real engagements. O'Hare ordered Fleming to conduct training sessions with every gunner in the air group. Not classroom lectures with diagrams and equations. Practical exercises using a simple technique that became known as the spot shooting method. Fleming would have gunners stand at their positions while another crew member walked along the flight deck, holding a model aircraft on a pole. As the model flew past at various angles, Fleming coached gunners to extend their aim forward by specific increments. 1 aircraft length for slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for moderate angles, 3 or more for steep crossing shots. The key was giving gunners a visual reference they could remember and apply instantly, automatically without thinking. Count plane lengths forward from the nose, then fire. That's it. That's the whole technique. The Lexington's gunnery officer was skeptical, but desperate for anything that might work. He authorized controlled testing during the carrier's operations off Truk Lagoon in late March 1944. He pulled ammunition expenditure and hit confirmation data for the previous 8 weeks as a baseline. Then he tracked the same metrics after Fleming's training program. The results were undeniable, impossible to argue with. Prior to the training, the air group's gunners averaged 4.2 hits per 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the end of April, just 6 weeks after implementing spot shooting, that rate had climbed to 9.1 hits per 100. The technique had more than doubled their effectiveness. Doubled it. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet with remarkable speed. The way good news always travels in wartime. By May 1944, variations of Fleming's spot shooting method were being taught aboard the carriers Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each carrier's gunnery officers added their own refinements, their own touches, but the core principle remained identical. Give gunners a simple visual measurement system tied directly to the target's apparent size, eliminating the need for conscious calculation. A gunner didn't need to know he was compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. He just needed to remember. 3 plane lengths forward for a crossing shot. Simple, memorable, effective. The technique worked because it matched how human visual processing actually functions at a neurological level. Our brains are exceptional at relative size comparison. We can judge whether something is twice as big or half as big almost instantly, but we're terrible at absolute distance estimation. Asking a gunner to lead by 50 feet meant nothing when he had no reference for what 50 feet looked like at 300 yards distance in 3-dimensional space. But lead by 2 plane lengths gave him an immediate visual standard he could apply without thought, without hesitation. The 0 he was tracking provided its own measuring stick. He just had to extend that measurement forward into empty space and trust it. The Army Air Forces adopted similar training protocols by mid-1944, though they called it radius of action shooting because every branch needs its own terminology. Technical manuals started including illustrations showing proper lead distances expressed in multiples of target wingspan or fuselage length. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School at Lavenham, England, rebuilt their entire training program around the technique during June 1944. Mission loss rates, while still significant, began declining. July 1944 showed 3.4% bomber losses per mission, compared to 5.2% the previous October. That difference of less than 2% represented hundreds of crewmen who flew home instead of dying over Germany. Hundreds of families who got their sons and husbands and brothers back. But knowing the technique and executing it under combat conditions remained two entirely different challenges. The human brain, even armed with the spot shooting method, still fought against itself when the shooting started, when death was screaming toward you at 400 miles per hour with cannons blazing. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces documented this phenomenon extensively during 1944 through interviews with returning gunners. The issue wasn't knowledge. Gunners could recite the proper lead distances perfectly during debriefings. Sitting in a chair with a cup of coffee, they understood it completely. The issue was that conscious knowledge evaporated under stress, replaced by primal instinct that screamed one message over and over: aim at the threat, aim at the threat, aim at the threat. Captain Harold Klein, an Army psychologist stationed at Bovingdon, studied this response through analysis of gun camera footage paired with post-mission interviews. He identified a pattern he termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would start an engagement using proper deflection. Their first bursts would be well placed, properly led. But as the enemy fighter closed and the perceived danger intensified, their aim point would progressively drift backward until they were shooting directly at or even behind the target. Klein's data showed this collapse happened fastest during head-on attacks, where the closing speed between bomber and fighter exceeded 500 miles per hour, and the gunner had perhaps 2 seconds before the enemy opened fire. Under that extreme stress, under that level of raw existential terror, rational technique dissolved into pure reaction. Point at the scary thing. Pull trigger. Hope. The only solution was repetition so extensive that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought entirely, embedding itself at the same neurological level as walking or catching a thrown ball or flinching away from heat. This required training time the military couldn't afford in 1942 and 1943, when they needed gunners immediately. Right now, thousands of them. But by late 1944, with Allied control of the air improving and training pipelines more established, gunnery schools extended their programs. The standard course that had been 4 weeks in 1942 expanded to 8 weeks, then 10. Students now fired 5,000 rounds during training instead of 1,000, and significantly, over half of those rounds went toward moving targets at realistic combat speeds. The Naval Air Gunnery School at Jacksonville, Florida, pioneered a particularly effective drill starting in August 1944. They mounted 50 caliber guns on motorized turrets that could spin and elevate rapidly, then had high-speed boats tow targets across the water at speeds up to 60 miles per hour while varying their distance and crossing angles randomly, unpredictably. Gunner trainees engaged these targets repeatedly, 50 to 70 passes per day, until their hands knew what to do without their brains having to tell them, until the act of leading became automatic as breathing. Instructors didn't correct students verbally during the drills. They simply had them shoot, check their hit pattern, adjust, and shoot again. The subconscious learned through feedback loops faster than the conscious. Mind learned through instruction. Elite gunners who survived 30 or more missions demonstrated something remarkable in combat footage analysis, something that separated them from everyone else. Their deflection aim points remained stable even under intense stress. When an FW-190 came screaming through the formation, with cannon fire flashing from its wings like lightning, when shells were tearing holes in the fuselage, when men were dying 3 feet away, these experienced gunners maintained their lead automatically. Their conscious minds could be terrified. Many admitted to being absolutely convinced they were about to die during certain engagements. But their hands kept the proper sight picture anyway. They'd achieved what martial artists call mushin, no mind, the state where technique happens without conscious direction, where the body acts and the mind only watches. But that level of proficiency took time and ammunition most gunners never received. The mathematics of wartime training were brutal and unforgiving. If creating an expert deflection shooter required 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of intensive training, but the bomber offensive needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months. Compromises were inevitable, painful but necessary. The majority of gunners flying combat missions never achieved true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in the conscious competent stage, capable of proper deflection shooting when conditions allowed them time to think, but vulnerable to collapse under extreme stress or when facing unexpected tactical situations. This created a strange stratification in combat effectiveness across the bomber stream. A bomber formation's defensive firepower wasn't uniform. It wasn't consistent. It depended heavily on which specific gunners were in which specific positions on which specific aircraft. A formation that happened to include several veterans with deep training could fight off attacks that would devastate a formation of newer crews with identical equipment. German fighter pilots learned to identify and exploit this disparity. They'd make initial probing attacks, gauge the quality and accuracy of defensive fire, then target bombers that showed hesitant or inaccurate responses while avoiding formations where the defensive fire was immediate, heavy, and precisely placed. They could tell within seconds which bombers were crewed by veterans and which were filled with replacements who'd freeze or panic or shoot at ghosts. Deflection shooting revolution that began with British experiments and American desperation didn't end when World War II concluded in 1945. The core principle that you must aim where the target will be rather than where it is became foundational to every weapon system developed afterward. The Mark 14 computing gunsight evolved into the Mark 18, which served through the Korean War, then into digital fire control computers that could process dozens of variables simultaneously. By Vietnam, fighter aircraft carried radar-assisted gun systems that calculated deflection automatically, requiring pilots only to keep targets within acquisition parameters. The F-4 Phantom's lead computing optical sight system did in microseconds what had taken Draper's mechanical gyroscopes significant fractions of a second. Modern air-to-air combat has largely moved beyond guns entirely. Missiles handle interception at ranges where deflection would require leading by miles rather than feet. But the underlying physics hasn't changed one bit, just the implementation. An AIM-120 AMRAAM missile uses inertial guidance and active radar to continuously update its trajectory toward where its target will be, executing deflection calculations thousands of times per second with perfect precision. The F-22 Raptor's AN/APG-77 radar doesn't just track targets. It predicts their future positions based on current velocity and acceleration vectors, then positions the aircraft and selects weapons accordingly. It's solving the same problem William Fleming solved with hand-drawn sketches in 1944. Now it's handled by computers processing teraflops instead of gunners counting plane lengths. Interestingly, deflection shooting fundamentals remain part of modern fighter pilot training, despite guns being tertiary weapons in contemporary air combat. Despite missiles doing most of the work, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, still teaches basic fighter maneuvers that include guns-only engagements. Not because pilots expect to dogfight with cannons in actual combat, but because learning to visually predict where a maneuvering target will be develops spatial awareness that applies to every aspect of air combat. A pilot who's mastered deflection shooting intuitively understands closure rates, angle off, and lead pursuit curves, concepts that matter whether you're firing a cannon or positioning for a missile shot or planning an intercept vector. The cognitive skills transfer seamlessly. The lessons extend beyond aviation into any domain involving fast-moving targets and split-second decisions. Modern anti-aircraft systems, from the Phalanx CIWS defending naval vessels to the CRAM protecting ground bases, are essentially sophisticated implementations of what those 1943 bomber gunners struggled to do manually with iron sights and frozen hands. The Phalanx fires 4,500 rounds per minute, 75 rounds per second at incoming missiles and aircraft. Its radar continuously calculates deflection and updates aim point faster than any human ever could. It makes the same corrections Eddie Kowalski needed over the Solomon Islands in 1942. Just faster, more precise, and without the human hesitation that cost so many lives. Even video games that simulate combat incorporate deflection mechanics, teaching players the same counterintuitive principle whether they realize it or not. Aim where the target is going. Games like War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator require players to lead moving targets manually, and new players experience the exact same frustration 1942 gunners felt, watching their tracers pass harmlessly behind enemy aircraft, cursing, firing again, missing again, until they internalize that leading is necessary. That instinct is wrong, and physics is right. The most skilled players, the ones at the top of leaderboards, develop the same unconscious competence that combat veterans achieved. Their hands adjusting aim without conscious thought. They're not calculating, they're not thinking. They're just doing. Eddie Kowalski survived the war, flew 43 missions total, made it home to Cleveland in November 1945, with a distinguished Flying Cross and nightmares that would wake him up for the next 30 years. In interviews decades later, when researchers tracked down surviving gunners to document their experiences, Eddie talked about that first engagement over the Solomons. The zero that got away because he aimed where every instinct told him to aim. He said he could still see it sometimes when he closed his eyes. The tracers arcing behind the tail. The perfect shot that wasn't. The feeling of helplessness as his ammunition counter spun down and the enemy pilot flew on, untouched, probably not even aware how close he'd come to dying if only the American gunner had known to aim 15 feet forward into empty air. Eddie learned eventually. They all did, the ones who survived long enough. By his 20th mission, he was leading properly, automatically, not thinking about it anymore, just tracking and firing and watching his bullets connect. He personally confirmed hits on 3 enemy aircraft in the last 6 months of the war. Maybe killed the pilots, maybe just damaged the planes enough that they crashed later or never flew again. He didn't know, didn't particularly want to know. What stayed with him wasn't the successes, it was the failures. The early missions, when he was doing everything right according to his training and watching men die because his training had been wrong. Because someone in 1924 had written a paper predicting exactly this problem and nobody had listened. Because physics didn't care about courage or determination or the American frontier tradition of marksmanship. Physics just was. Immutable. Unforgiving. Wars get won and lost on details most people never think about. The big stories are about D-Day and Midway and atomic bombs. The dramatic moments when history pivots visibly, but underneath those moments are thousands of smaller problems that had to be solved. Technical challenges, training failures, human limitations that had to be overcome or worked around. The deflection shooting crisis was one of those problems. Not glamorous, not the stuff of Hollywood movies. Just young men standing in bomber turrets, freezing and terrified, trying to hit targets moving faster than anything in human history had ever moved, failing because nobody had taught them how, dying because the solution was counterintuitive and human brains don't naturally do counterintuitive under stress. The fact that the problem got solved at all is remarkable. That it got solved through a combination of forgotten research papers, British clay pigeon shooters, MIT engineers, and a sergeant with a notebook is even more remarkable. That it got solved fast enough to matter, to actually change the outcome of the war, feels almost miraculous. But it wasn't a miracle. It was just people, desperate and scared and determined, refusing to accept that the problem was unsolvable. Refusing to keep doing what didn't work just because it was standard procedure. Refusing to let more men die when the solution was sitting there, waiting to be found, waiting to be implemented, waiting to save lives. The next time you're on an aircraft and you see the pilot making tiny adjustments during approach, or you watch a missile interceptor test on the news, or you play a video game where you have to lead a moving target, remember, Eddie Kowalski standing in that B-17 over the Solomons in December 1942. Remember the thousands of gunners who learned to aim at nothing, who trained their hands to do what their eyes said was wrong, who proved that humans can override instinct when survival demands it. The lesson isn't about deflection shooting specifically. It's about being willing to question what feels obvious, to test what seems certain, to change what isn't working, even when the change feels unnatural. That's how wars get won. That's how progress happens. That's how we survive situations that should kill us. One counterintuitive solution at a time. One conscious choice to ignore instinct and trust physics. One gunner aiming at empty sky and pulling the trigger anyway. Hoping the math is right, praying the bullets find their mark, and watching tracer fire arc through the darkness toward where the enemy will be when the future catches up with the present.